The problem with flashbacks in your novel. Can they hurt your novel? Can they be helpful? Can they hurt your novel to a point where no one wants to read it? We're going to be addressing those questions and more, and we're starting right now. You don't want to waste those first few pages that are critical. You want to grab people's attention as fast as possible and keep it. You want to put the protagonist in there as fast as possible and let the reader connect with the protagonist as fast as they can, because that's what's going to make them want to keep on reading, when we connect with the protagonist, not a flashback of something that happened 1,000 years ago or 100 years ago. We want to know what's happening in the present day, because what makes people want to turn the page is suspense. We want to know what's going to happen next. And the problem with the flashback is it's safe. We know everything is going to be okay for the characters involved. We want to make sure that in our novels, the protagonists, what they care about most is that threat. That's going to make the reader want to turn the page as fast as possible to find out what's going to happen next. It doesn't matter if it's science fiction, horror, drama, or a comedy. They're all based on suspense. When we don't know if the protagonist is going to be safe, that's going to make us want to turn the page. As a new writer, you want to make sure that the most important thing you do is make the reader feel. If the reader is feeling anything, they're going to keep turning the page. If a character is reading a drama and they're feeling sad, they're going to turn the page. If they're reading a horror novel and they feel scared, they're going to turn the page. If they're reading a comedy and they're laughing, they're going to turn the page. You always have to make sure as a writer that you're putting information in there that's going to make the reader feel something. If the reader isn't feeling anything, that's usually when the reader closes the book and they stop reading, because it's just like reading a phone book. The problem with a flashback is that's pretty much what you're doing. You're stopping the reader from feeling. You're just giving them a tremendous amount of information saying this is what has happened, stopping the reader from feeling any suspense or any wonder. The biggest questions of who, what, when, why, and how don't get asked. They're just reading page after page of something that has happened. And it's really difficult to feel anything when you're reading about something that has happened. And that's usually when the reader closes the book. So as a writer, you have to look at what you're writing down and ask yourself, are people going to feel anything when reading this? Because if they do, they're going to keep turning the page. But if they stop feeling, that's when they stop reading. And a flashback can make that happen. It will stop people from feeling anything, and especially if it's right at the beginning. They're going to close the book and never come back. So how do we add information into your novel that you would have put into your flashback? Well, the trick is you want to break that information up, not all at once at the beginning. You want to introduce your protagonist right away and let us get to know their life in the present time. And then you can start adding a little bit of information about the character's past here and there throughout the novel. So you're not actually bringing your novel to a complete stop to have a tremendous amount of information that brings your story to a stop like a car stepping on the brake. You want to be able to break up your flashback information. So maybe a little bit at the beginning of a chapter, maybe a little bit more information at the next chapter. So that way, all of the information is being delivered, but you're breaking it up here and there, as opposed to 50 pages right at the very start. The biggest problem with flashbacks in your novel is that they slow down the pace. It's understandable why a writer would want to put them in there. They want to fill the reader in with information about what's happened in the past, who is the protagonist, so the reader can understand and have a full understanding of who, what, where, and when before the novel begins. This makes sense, but the problem is that it slows down the pacing of your novel. The reader wants to get to know the protagonist. They want to know who the protagonist is and what they need to learn in order to be happy. The problem with a flashback is it's almost like a newspaper. We're just being given information. We're being told what has happened. A successful novel is about tension, suspense, wanting to know what's going to happen next. The problem is when you have a flashback, we know everyone is going to be safe. Because if something bad happens to one of the main characters, how can they be in the novel? The problem with flashbacks is it's like reading a newspaper. You're simply being told information, and you can't really invest emotionally into any. It's like when you read a newspaper, can you emotionally get invested into it? Not really. You're just reading about information, and then you put the newspaper down and walk away. A flashback does the same thing. It just gives you a ton of information on what has happened. By the 10th, 15th, 20th page, you haven't connected emotionally. And the beginning of your novel is the riskiest part. That's when the reader is most likely to put your book down and not want to read anymore. Because chances are when you've read a novel, the first 10 or 15 pages are the hardest to get into. You don't know anybody. You don't know what's happening. But after you get halfway through, you want to finish that novel. Because you have made an emotional connection with the characters and their wants and needs. With a flashback, you can't make that connection. So you're just reading all of this information like you would if you were reading a newspaper. And then you just put the book down and walk away. And you want to come back to reading it, but realistically, you never do come back to read it. A flashback allows you to understand what's happening, but then all of a sudden the flashback ends and now the story begins. Now all of a sudden you're starting all over again. Now it's like you're reading from page 1. Everything that you've learned in the beginning, it might apply later in the novel, but now that you're on page 20 or 30, now all of a sudden you're just starting all over again. Now you have to make a new emotional investment into the new characters in the present day. Now, if you're a successful novel writer like Stephen King or Dan Brown, yes, you can have flashbacks because people are more likely to read a book by Stephen King and keep on reading. There have been some books he has written in which parts of it are boring, but yet people are willing to keep reading because it's Stephen King. But as a new writer, you want to capture everyone who is reading your book right away. You don't want people reading page 1 or 2 and then stopping. You want to get their attention as fast as possible and keep it. And as a new writer, people are more likely not to want to read your book. This is a tricky part about being a new writer. People will pass by your book in a bookstore. So if you do manage to get someone to read your book, you want to get them reading as much as they can, as fast as they can. And a flashback at the beginning of your novel acts almost like a newspaper. You're just giving people information that's going to cause them to want to stop reading. All successful novels allow the reader to feel as though they are the protagonist, as though they are in the novel, as though the novel is happening to them. Whenever you write something, you want to make sure that the reader feels as though they are the protagonist, as though the story is happening to them, as though the story has become alive, as though you, the reader, are pulled inside the story itself. And a flashback creates this gap between you, the reader, and your novel. You don't want to have that gap, because that's what it feels like when you read a newspaper. You feel as though there is a gap between you and the events that has happened. So when you write a novel, you want to make sure that you pull the protagonist into your story. And writing 50 pages of flashback at the beginning of your novel can stop that from happening. You want to break up that information and spread it throughout the novel. So that way, you're not going to slow down your novel to a complete stop with your flashback information. Just enough to let people know what happened in the past, but then you quickly get back into the present. And after a few pages, you can give them just a little touch more of what has happened in the past. And then go back into the present. So this way, the story always feels like it's moving forward. If you enjoyed watching this video, be sure to check out my website, where I have a tremendous amount of information that will help you become the greatest writer you can be. In fact, I'm going to leave a link to my website in the description down below, so you can visit my site right away and you can start reading and find out everything there is to know about how you can become the greatest writer you can be. Be sure to check out my next video on whose writing style should you copy. Does it benefit you to copy another successful writer? Whose writing style should you copy? Or should you write your own style? I'm going to leave a link to that video right here, and you can start watching that video right now on whose writing style should you copy.